Blood on the Bayous is supported in part by Dr. B.B. Trotter from Abilene, Texas, and the Fort Butler Foundation. Thank you.
I'm Don Frazier, and we're continuing the series on Texas and Louisiana in the Civil War. One thing needs to be perfectly clear. The Confederacy defended slavery and enshrined it in its national documents. That was an important component to the entire vision of the Confederate States of America. However, not everybody was as enthusiastic about it as the slave owners that had brought this about. And in fact, the Confederacy resorted to conscription to support what may or may not have been a particularly popular position. It's amazing that the Confederacy had to force people to fight for its independence. Now, paradoxically, very heavy-handed Union tactics, the hard hand of war, or total war in some circles, actually started getting people a lot more sympathetic to the Confederacy after the fact. So you may have resisted secession and have not been a slave owner or even been interested in protecting the institution of slavery, although you could argue that either way. Even if you had no interest in protecting slavery, you began to be interested in getting the Yankees out of your town, out of your state, out of your region, because they did horrible things whenever they showed up. The Confiscation Acts allowed them to do it. So now there's this strange sort of shift. What had been a lack of support for the Confederacy is reinforced by conscription forcing you to support the Confederacy, at the same time that Union excesses is causing support for the Confederacy to seem like a much more reasonable position. Remarkable war, this American Civil War. Well, militarily, the fighting is in a stalemate. In Virginia, both armies are pretty much where they had been for the last year. There's a stalemate in Tennessee at the beginning of 1863. Those armies are pretty much where they had been in the middle of last year. There's a stalemate in Mississippi. Vicksburg remains defiant. So it looks like this war has kind of reached this interesting sort of pivot point. But the timetable had slowed considerably. In the process, what had been a resistance to the election of Abraham Lincoln and an insurgency against the idea of federal overreach began to transition into an existential fight over whose vision of the United States would prevail. One thing's for sure. If you were going to destroy the Confederacy and make sure that only one vision of the nation prevailed, slavery had to go. The problem is, we're a constitutional republic, and the framework, the laws were not in place to destroy slavery. Not yet. They wouldn't be in place until the passage of the 13th Amendment. So the destruction of slavery couldn't be rushed. There was a process involved. Well, the people that were helping to manage this process, besides the senators, the representatives in Congress, were members of Lincoln's cabinet. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton had to maneuver politics while also balancing the reality of armies in the field. So it's not like politics happens in a vacuum. There's also some fighting going on, and there's military strategic aims playing out as well. Well, then he has to work with General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. Halleck's task is to translate public policy, done by the politicians, into some sort of military strategy. So we've met some people that are pushing these policies and these agendas. People like Benjamin Butler were certainly people that were trying to push their vision of what the nation should be from their various positions out in the field. In fact, over the first 2 years of the war, slaves had gone from being contraband of war, essentially captured munitions, to now they were self-emancipated slaves. They had transitioned over these 2 years from property to people. Now, in Louisiana, people like Nathaniel P. Banks were in charge of continuing this process. Now, here's where the Emancipation Proclamation fits in. In reality, the Emancipation Proclamation is a fairly weak proclamation. I mean, all it does is it frees the slaves in territories, in the regions that are in rebellion to the federal government. So it has no real control there. They do not have the ability to enforce this proclamation there. However, Confiscation Acts, and later on the Militia Act, have created the beginning of a latticework, a framework, that would set up the Emancipation Proclamation to do one thing and do it very, very well. The Emancipation Proclamation pre-frees all the slaves, so that when Union armies go into these areas still in rebellion, the slaves aren't slaves. They are liberated people. I almost said citizens. We're not there yet, but that's the direction we're going. So it's almost like captives being set free that are immediately have this status within the federal government of being people that can now lend their weight to the war effort. What that means is that you can apply the Militia Act and use these now liberated people as conscripts into the Union Army. You can press them into service. And if not into the Union Army, you can put them on public works, etc. Essentially, you put them on the federal dole. Well, where do these enslaved people live in the greatest numbers? The Mississippi Valley. In particular, from about Memphis down to New Orleans. That is the most densely populated slave region as a large region in the country. You roll out the maps of the Mississippi Valley, take a look at what the census of 1860 revealed. That's where the slaves live. So perhaps what comes next, now that the Emancipation Proclamation has told everyone that those people are free, but they're captives, not slaves, that perhaps Union armies should move in to the Mississippi Valley. Do Union armies need to take Vicksburg and Port Hudson in order to affect Union war aims in the lower Mississippi? Not really. What you really want to do is control the countryside around Vicksburg and Port Hudson. Contain those Confederate armies. In essence, those Confederate citadels have become Confederate prisons, which are keeping the Confederates from being able to affect the Union policy of harvesting the emancipated population of the lower Mississippi. It's an interesting transition that's going on in the lower Mississippi Valley, and it is apocalyptic in its implications for the Confederacy and the South.